We're talking about how to determine the colors that you want to use in your painting. And remembering also the photograph is just a place to start. It gives us ideas of color to use, but we're looking more for colors that we can mix from our palette, which means the more we use it, the more you paint, the more you develop your own color sense. And being able to mix colors that suggest the main elements of painting. In other words, I want to mix colors, I'm looking at this reference, in the light area that suggests these lights that are kind of rimming the trees, or the suggest of warm sunlight on the rocks. That doesn't always mean matching the color. A lot of these colors in the lights get too pale, they get washed out, they don't show any temperature. And that's what shows light, is the temperature of the color and the value of the color. Same thing here in the sky. There's no color in the sky. It just gets washed out. Clouds are a darker value, but I want to push cooler clouds and a lot warmer sky to suggest that the sun is just out of sight, but somewhere over here on the right side. So pushing the colors to suggest distance, like these hills back in here. This color works pretty good, but I would push it a bit of a stronger red-violet and really suggest the more muted, warm violets that are hitting it. But using colors in this case that really push the distance in the painting, the idea that there's depth instead of a flat view. Then as I come forward, I want to use colors that suggest the plains. There we're talking mostly about value, but we're using colors that are the right value, that make these trees stand up, that make the hills here look slanted, the field look flat, or the water look flat. But colors that emphasize the light as well. When we look at this field in here, there's a ton of color. Same thing with the trees. There's a variety. There's a different color for this tree, that tree, for these trees in the background. These are all different. Each one is a subtle color change. So I want to shoot for color changes that work, for colors that suggest light and colors that suggest distance. And again, the more I paint with a certain palette, it's somewhat limited, which is good because you have to mix your colors instead of relying on a bunch of accent colors. And you can add to that palette, but the more you add, they're always going to be just accent colors. We want to focus on using the colors in our palette enough that we really develop our own color sense. Now, I made some changes on some of these images here. This is a scene in Colorado. And again, I want to be aware that the light is in front of me. It's not behind me. It's in front over to the right side, because you can see where the light kind of hits the edges of the trees and the edges of the rocks here. But when I simplify this, I want to make it just a bit graphic. Whether it's flatten out this area, I added some more distant hills to kind of balance off that side, give a little more weight to the right side here. And I'll generally, if you just think back to front, flattening out with an overall color. And when I'm using Photoshop, obviously, but I'm thinking in terms of this being ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson with a touch of yellow or orange. This being ultramarine blue with a little bit of orange and yellow. Not much, because this has to stay kind of bluish green. And just varying the color. But the thought process is, what color on my palette or from the color wheel do I start with? And how do I modify it? And the simpler you can keep it, the better. The field becomes a variety of color, but bigger flat areas. Because I can always blend these colors together a little bit. But I have an orange, a red, a yellow green, kind of a bluish green here, a green here, more muted greens here and here. So I'm thinking in terms of the primary, secondary colors and how I can subtly change them. I can change them with white, obviously, because this is a flat plane. So I got the lighter orange, lighter red, lighter yellow greens. And I can also change it with temperature, more blue. I want to stick primarily with warmer colors, but I can put in a few lighter, cooler colors. Just because some of the grasses and fields is a bluish green or a violet. I just have to remember to add a little bit of yellow to warm them up slightly. But same thing here, simplifying the shapes. And simplifying color always comes from the idea of simplifying shape. If I don't simplify the shape, I can't simplify the color. So I simplify the shape and the value, then it makes it easier to come up with a more simplified color. That's why composition matters the most, because that's where I do all the prep work of shape, value, and then color. Because I really can't do anything with color until I simplify the shapes and the values. So thinking in terms of the planes, all the uprights are dark with lights on top. All the flat planes are light with maybe a few dark accents. The slanted planes are dark, but not as dark as the uprights. Getting big, simple, flat areas, getting the right simple value, then color I can make more complicated. But still, I'm simplifying it compared to the photograph. This looks very complicated. I like it, but I want to be able to block it in like this first. Then I can mess it up, add more detail. Not much detail in here, a little bit of value change, but most of it's just subtle color change. And you can see also in the trees, I've eliminated all that detail in just simple dark and light. It just reads better. So I'm using color to help viewer see the painting better, a little more simply. Simple is always a lot better than more complicated, but I think we get the idea that if we make the painting more complicated, it's going to look better. And it's a fairly simple image. Vertical trees, a couple of slanted hills, and a flat plane. Not much going on. But I want to use color to make it more interesting. I'm going to determine the color by, first of all, creating depth. Some different layers of trees. I got the foreground layers of these aspens, background layer of these pine trees. Then I want to simplify the shapes and values of the field and the rocks and see what changes I can make to make it a bit more interesting. Changes I made here, and I've made pretty extensive changes. I didn't keep it all that simple, but this is more simple than the photograph. You can see the bluish green. Again, this right here is blue and yellow, and this is blue and yellow. Difference is there's just more blue back in here and more yellow here. And then I add the modifier. This would be the equivalent of blue, a little bit of yellow, and a touch of alizarin. And this is yellow and blue with maybe a little bit of cad red or orange, not as muted as the darker, more distant color. But simple dark and light on the aspens, simple dark and light on the pine trees, but using color to really separate them. Where in the photograph, there's no separation. Well, there's a little bit. You can see the slightly lighter yellow-green on the aspens. But to me, this is what painting from a photograph really entails, is how to improve on the shapes, making them simple, improve on the values, again simplifying, and improve on the color by using color to show depth and light. Then I moved from, and one thing will change on the, maybe on the photograph, is this is a slanted hill here and a flat plane here. So I need to change the values. I do have the flat plane slightly darker. So it does work, but I might flip that. I might make it a little darker on the slanted and a little lighter on the flat plane. And then down below I started with just a big flat light reddish orange field here, kind of a orange green, yellow with a little blue and some orange to make kind of an orange green here. And this is more of an orange or reddish orange hill up there. So thinking in terms of what colors can I mix that look different. The photograph gives me a little bit of variety. I can see some reds and orange in the grass. This is August, so the grass is pretty just dried out. But the dry grass color does help me get a little variation. And I can push it as much as I want. And I pushed also in the shrubbery. Instead of green shrubbery around the rocks, I made kind of a reddish violet. Again, the red violet's alizarin with just a little bit of yellow in it, not much. And alizarin crimson is a red violet, and then just a darker version. When you go from the light to the shadow, keep it simple, just make it darker. Same color, less white. After a while, you learn to think more in terms of temperature, so that when I see the red violet shrubbery, I can think temperature also, and I can think more yellow in alizarin. So I'm thinking just warmer. It goes from a red violet to almost a red orange. And then the shadow being more violet, more blues with a little less red. So it just becomes cooler. If I'm thinking temperature, a red violet bush becomes red orange in the light and red violet in the shadow. And that gives me my temperature contrast. But if nothing else, just think more or less white to get your dark and light. And then think about cooling down the shadow and warming up the light area a little bit. But all these variations in the grass are just a little more white, a little less white. Or if it's just color variation, I'm just subtly changing the color a little bit. The next thing I would do on here, or I might do this first, is crop it. This right side, this tree way over here, really doesn't do anything. So I could cut off everything to right about there. That makes a better composition because it eliminates what's not important. And I can probably lift up this tree and make it the tallest instead of these two being equal height. I don't want things being too equal. Now going to the next one. This is in Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming. And you can see the photograph's kind of washed out. And the trees just become kind of flat. There's no separation of depth in these trees. So again, I want to create layers. I want a layer of lighter trees back in here, and then I want to pull some, maybe have a little lighter back in here, back in here. So I want to pull out some of these as being distant trees. Then the rest of the trees will be up front. The photograph does not show that much separation, but I want to show it in terms of creating some depth. So I'll go more bluish greens back in here, a little darker darks, and more yellow green up front here. And I can really emphasize this background hill back in there. And then same thing here, just suggest more color variation. So I've pushed that background hill, made it a bit longer. I have the equivalent of ultramarine blue, but just maybe even just a touch of orange. Orange has enough yellow in it that it turns the blue slightly green if I just add a little bit of orange. Some of the oranges you can buy are a bit more yellow orange and some are a bit more red orange. But anyway, more blue than yellow, and here's more yellow than blue. And just darker here with a bit more yellow in the shadow. Not quite as dark here with a bit more blue than yellow. So it's a, you know, if we're just thinking in terms of value and temperature, it makes mixing color a lot easier. And the more we do that, the more it gets away from just copying the photograph. And some photographs work well. You know, some photographs, the color's pretty good, but still, I want to think in terms of what the photograph needs. So the darker darks up in front here, I even had maybe a bit of a 3 layers, this lighter dark and darker dark. But if your painting looks this way after the block in, it's fairly flat still because there's not much variation in these shapes, but it still works. And I'd have no problem leaving a painting like this, where in this case the trees are somewhat flat because it's just 2 value changes. You still need maybe a third or some broken color within the values, but this still works. And same thing with the grass. There's subtle color changes, so I want to push that, go a little further than what the photograph does. And I'm going with a little bit of yellow-green because the trees are green and blue-green, so I don't want too much green, so I went with the kind of a red-orange grass and a lighter orange or red because the grass here, I don't want it to be green. And pushing the value of the blue-violet. This would be the equivalent of blue with a little bit of alizarin. And same color, just 98% white for the foam in there. The color doesn't have to be very complicated, but the thought process has to be correct. What you're thinking in terms of simplifying shape, simplifying value, and then keeping the color simple. So there you can see the somewhat flat. There's some stuff there I think makes it interesting. And when I push the color, it pops it a bit more and push the value difference. Created some cast shadows here that aren't in the photograph. I pushed the sun down a little bit from the side. Photograph has the sun more, it's probably about 2 o'clock, so shadows are still kind of flat, plus it's summer. So that's what I'm going to look for in the photograph, is how to improve on it color-wise. What we like about painting is color, but what makes it work is more the values and the shapes and composition.